The air that morning was thin and still when they lifted the concrete slab off the old farm well. The metal cables creaked, the crane humming low as it strained against the weight. And when the light finally reached the bottom, every sound in the clearing fell away. All that was left was the shape of a man-bones bound tight, curled in on themselves as if trying to hold on to the dark. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Back in 2002, life in Franklin still moved at the pace of a slow-turning calendar. The town sat tucked between soft green ridges with Main Street running quiet by dusk, and the smell of pine drifting in through open windows. I'd lived there my whole life, and for folks like us, the seasons were what told time, not the clocks, not the headlines. That October had come in gentle. Daylight thinned early, but the air carried that clean, smoky scent from the first wood stoves being lit. Every year, right around then, my friend Thomas Reed would start talking about the hunt. It was a ritual for him, one that steadied his year like a heartbeat. Thomas was a simple man, the kind you could trust with your truck, your tools, or your life if it came to that. He worked over at Jimmy Parker's gas station, tall, lean hands always streaked with grease, and still managed to keep that calm way about him. His wife Susan used to say he could fix anything but the clock, because time, she'd joke, was the only thing he couldn't slow down. Their house sat on the edge of town, one of those split-level places with a white porch rail and a little flag fluttering out front. Most evenings you could find Thomas in the driveway, tinkering under the hood of someone's old Chevy country radio humming from the workbench, Susan calling him in for dinner, just as the sun dipped behind the trees. They'd been married more than 20 years. Their 2 kids were grown and gone, one in Tennessee, one out west, and for the first time the house was just theirs again. I remember the week before he left that year. We'd been sitting outside the station one afternoon nursing coffee from paper cups. Thomas told me he was heading out Thursday morning, same spot he always camped up past the ranger station near an old logging road that hadn't seen a real truck in decades. "Gonna get a big one this year," he'd said, smiling like a man who already felt at peace just thinking about the woods. He was looking forward to that quiet. Said the shop had been busy and Susan's classes had started back up at the high school. Hunting season was his reset button, the thing that reminded him who he was when life got too loud. When Thursday came, I happened to see his truck pull out from town. Old blue Ford dented on the passenger side, bed full of gear, sleeping bag, thermos, orange jacket folded neat on top. He waved through the window when he saw me, 2 fingers off the wheel. That easy smile still there. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I'd ever see him. The next couple of days went by like any other late October weekend in Franklin. The leaves were turning fast gold, spilling down from the hillsides, swirling through the streets. Folks were prepping for the Halloween parade downtown. I worked a few hours helping clear trails after a windstorm, then spent Saturday evening on my porch, listening to football on the radio and the wind moving through the trees. Susan stopped by the ranger station Friday to drop off a box of donuts. She looked relaxed. Said Thomas had made it up there just fine. She even laughed, told me he'd promised not to come home empty-handed this time. That was the thing about Susan, even when she worried she hid it behind kindness. By Saturday night, I remember thinking how still it was. The kind of still that settles over the mountains when the air starts to cool and every sound feels sharper. You could almost hear the forest breathe out there. Sunday rolled in gray and quiet. I saw Susan's car pass through town mid-morning, heading toward the edge of the forest road. Later, she told me she'd just been restless, wanted to make sure he was all right, even though she knew better than to bother him mid-hunt. But when dusk came and no headlights turned down their drive, something in her shifted. She called me after dark, her voice low but steady. "Dan," she said, "Tom's not back yet." I told her not to worry, that he'd probably stayed out an extra night waiting for one more deer before the cold set in. That kind of thing wasn't unusual for him. Still, as I hung up, I remember standing by my kitchen window for a long while watching the streetlight glow across the empty road. The quiet that night felt different, not peaceful, just waiting. By Monday morning, the frost still hadn't lifted from the grass, and Susan's porch light was still burning in the daylight. She stood at the edge of her driveway, phone in hand, staring down the empty street that led toward the mountains. The Ford should have been rumbling home by now, that familiar sound of tires on gravel, that whistle from the old engine. But there was only silence stretching out past the tree line, heavy and cold as the fog rolling in from the hills. That Monday morning started with the kind of stillness that settles over the mountains before the sun has burned the frost off the fields. I remember standing on my porch, coffee going cold in my hand, watching a pale ribbon of fog curl through the holler below town. That quiet, easy calm was broken by the sound of tires crunching up my gravel drive. It was Susan. She'd been up all night, you could tell. Her eyes were red, her voice thin and deliberate when she said, "He's not home, Dan." Not a word. I told her to come inside, but she wouldn't sit. She just stood there by the door looking at the woods behind my house like they might answer her. Thomas had missed a night before, sure, but never two, not without a call or a note. And for a man who knew those ridges as well as he did, the idea of him just getting lost didn't sit right with either of us. By mid-morning, we were at the sheriff's office filing a missing person report. Sheriff Johnson knew Thomas. Everyone in Franklin did. The man had fixed half the cars in town. Johnson took it seriously from the start. Within a few hours, he had a deputy and a couple of local volunteers ready to head up to the clearing where Thomas usually parked. I joined them. The drive up Highway 28 was quiet, just the hum of the tires and the wind pushing dry leaves across the road. When we reached the turnoff, the forest road narrowed, climbing between ridges where sunlight barely touched the ground. We found his truck exactly where Susan said it would be. Old blue Ford doors locked, parked neat at the edge of the clearing like he'd just stepped away for a minute. But the longer we looked, the stranger it seemed. The keys were on the seat. His sleeping bag, his rifle, his backpack, all still there. Everything he would have needed for a weekend in the woods untouched. The thermos was full. The bed of the truck held a layer of pine needles that hadn't been disturbed by wind or boots. It was as if he'd parked, got out, and vanished into the trees without a single purpose. The air up there felt colder than in town, sharper somehow. A few of us started combing through the brush, calling his name, our voices carrying over the slopes and dying in the distance. The sheriff marked a perimeter, told us to keep within sight of one another. By noon, we'd covered nearly a mile in every direction. There wasn't so much as a footprint. The ground was hard dry from weeks without rain. Every now and then, I'd catch a flash of orange between the trees, a hunter's vest or marker flag, and for a heartbeat, I thought it might be him. But it never was. When dusk came, we built a small fire and radioed back to town. The temperature dropped into the 40s and mist settled over the clearing. The sheriff called the search for the night. I stayed back a while, standing beside Thomas's truck, staring into the dark tree line. You could hear the faint rush of a creek somewhere below and the occasional snap of a branch, maybe a deer moving through. I kept thinking if he were out there, he'd hear us. He'd make a noise, wave a flashlight, something. But the woods stayed silent. The next morning, more volunteers arrived, neighbors, co-workers, even a few old-timers who knew those ridges better than anyone. They spread out in teams, each taking a sector. I walked with two men from the search and rescue crew, following a game trail down toward the ravine. We looked for signs of a fall, a broken branch, a torn piece of clothing, anything that might tell us where he'd gone. Nothing. We even checked the nearby streams, figuring he might have slipped trying to cross one. The water ran clear and cold, carrying leaves that spun in slow eddies. No trace of him. By the third day, the sheriff brought in 2 German shepherds trained for tracking. They picked up his scent near the truck, but lost it less than a few hundred yards out where the ground turned to rock. I'll never forget watching those dogs circle noses, low tails stiff, and then sit down confused. It was like the trail just stopped existing. The handler tried to explain, said the wind could have shifted or maybe rain had washed the scent away, but there hadn't been rain in days. Deep down, none of us believed it. The town pulled together in those first weeks. Folks donated food, flashlights, gas money. The local diner stayed open late for the searchers coming in hungry and worn out. Even the kids from the high school helped make posters with Thomas's picture. Susan came out every morning, standing off to the side while we went over the maps. I could tell she was trying to hold on to hope, but it was already wearing thin. She kept saying, "He wouldn't just leave. He wouldn't do that to me." And I believed her. By the end of the week, we'd combed 5 miles around that clearing, checked every ravine, every deer path, every abandoned cabin within reach. The sheriff even brought in a helicopter with a thermal camera flying grid patterns over the hills. From the ground, we could hear it droning overhead, circling wider and wider. But even the air offered no answers. The screen showed nothing but cold forest. After 10 days, the search scaled back. Deputies started rotating out, and the volunteers went home. But Susan didn't stop. Every weekend, she drove that winding road back into the forest, parking in the same spot where we'd found his truck. Sometimes I went with her. She'd walk the trails for hours, carrying a map she'd drawn by hand, marking every place we'd already checked. She'd kneel by the creeks, sift through the leaves, call his name softly like he might answer if she said it just right. Winter came early that year. Snow settled on the ridges and turned the forest quiet again, burying the tracks we'd made. When spring thawed, the ground Susan started back up. By then, the official search had ended and the sheriff had moved on to other cases. But she never gave up. I remember seeing her at the diner one evening, maps spread out across the booth, notes scrawled in the margins. She'd gotten thinner, her voice quieter. All she said to me was, "There's still something out there, Dan. I can feel it." In the second year, time dulled things for most people. The posters faded in the rain. The town stopped talking about it as much. But for Susan, it was like the calendar had frozen on October 2002. She still drove out there, still checked old logging trails. The rest of us tried to help where we could, but truthfully, we were running out of places to look. Then, one day late that summer, a local hunter came into the sheriff's office saying he'd found a patch of ground deep in the woods where the grass grew thicker and greener than anywhere around it. Claimed it looked wrong. Sheriff Johnson and one of his deputies went out there with shovels. They dug down a few feet and hit a flat stone that looked like it had been set there by hand. Beneath it, though, there was nothing but tin cans and animal bones, just an old dump site. Susan drove out there herself when she heard. I remember the look in her eyes when she came back tired hollow, but still not ready to quit. Years passed like that. I retired from the Ranger service in '04, but every now and then I'd still get a call from her asking if I'd heard anything new. I never had. The new sheriff took over and had his hands full with other problems, drugs, theft, the usual trouble that creeps in when the economy's bad. The Reed case faded into the background. But Susan's hope didn't. She sold their house, moved in with her daughter down in Georgia, yet she kept coming back, spending her own money on private investigators and local guides who promised more than they ever found. By then, most folks figured Thomas had gone off the grid, maybe started over somewhere else. But I couldn't believe that. Not him. He was too rooted, too loyal. If he'd left by choice, he would have left a word. The last time I saw Susan before everything changed was in early 2006. She stopped by my place on her way back from the forest. The wind was up that day, blowing the last of the dead leaves off the trees. She stood on my porch and said, "Dan, I'm done searching." I didn't know what to say. She looked like someone who'd finally reached the edge of a map. But even then, I could tell she didn't mean it. A few weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. Forestry workers had found something by a creek bed, a skull worn smooth by soil and time. They thought it might belong to a man mid-40s, maybe older. I remember the silence that followed after the deputy told me. Just the hum of the line and his voice low. Could be him. Susan flew back from Georgia the next day. I met her at the airport, and the look on her face said everything. It wasn't relief, not yet, just that deep, heavy kind of knowing that sits between hope and dread. The skull was sent off for analysis, and we waited. Weeks passed with no answers. The lab said the teeth were too damaged for a quick match, and DNA was hit or miss with remains that old. For a while, it felt like we were right back where we'd started. Another maybe. Another ghost of a lead. The sheriff kept his promise, though. He reopened the case, started reviewing every file, every statement. He brought in a new detective young guy named Mark Stevens, sharp but patient. Stevens went back over all the interviews, every scrap of paper that had been filed since 2002. And that's when the story started to shift. It began with a name that had been there from the start but hadn't drawn much attention, Christopher Doyle. He owned a few acres not far from where Thomas used to hunt, and he and Thomas had been in a dispute over a fence line years back. Most folks in town knew about it. They'd argued more than once. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Men butt heads out here, especially over land. But now, with 5 years gone and a skull in the dirt, the sheriff's office started looking at him differently. When I heard that name again, something in me went cold. I'd seen Doyle a few times around town, always alone, eyes hard, like someone holding on to anger too long. The idea that he might be connected to what happened didn't feel far-fetched. But back then, it was just a whisper, a hunch, waiting for proof. I didn't know it yet, but that single thread, the neighbor, the old argument, the ground they both claimed was about to unravel, the silence that had held this town for nearly 5 years. And by the time it did, none of us would look at those mountains the same way again. When I think back to that spring, what I remember most is how quiet the forest had become. After years of searching, the woods no longer felt alive with hope, just heavy with unanswered questions. The sheriff's new detective, Mark Stevens, had started reopening old files, and I'd stopped by the office a few times to talk things over. He was younger than most of us, but careful he didn't rush to assumptions. Still, I could tell the case had gotten under his skin. It had under all of ours. Thomas had been gone nearly 5 years, and though Susan had tried to start a new life down in Georgia, she called me often to ask if there was anything new. Most times there wasn't. But that spring, for the first time in a long while, something began to stir. The new sheriff had decided to review every unsolved case on the books, and Thomas's stood out like a wound that never healed. Stevens came by one evening with a box of papers and asked if I'd sit with him for a while. He wanted to understand who Thomas really was, how he lived, what kind of man he'd been. We sat on my porch till the light went soft, going through old notes, maps, statements from the early days of the search. Most of it we'd read before. But there in the middle of a report was a line about a property dispute, something I'd nearly forgotten. It named a man called Christopher Doyle. He lived just a few miles from the clearing where Thomas's truck had been found. Doyle was a carpenter known around town for doing odd jobs and for having a temper that could light up like dry tinder. Years back, he and Thomas had argued about a fence line whose land started, whose trees fell on whose side. It had even gone to small claims court once, but no one ever really settled it. At the time, we thought it was just another neighbor quarrel. Around here, land can make decent men do foolish things. But as Stevens talked through the details, a pattern started forming in my mind that I hadn't seen before, or maybe hadn't wanted to. A few days later, I rode with him out toward Doyle's place. It sat on the edge of the forest, an old farmhouse that had probably been standing since the 40s, roof sagging in the middle weeds, grown up high along the fence. The yard was cluttered with scrap lumber, old machinery, and a rusted-out truck bed half full of rainwater. Doyle came out from his workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked older than I remembered, heavier around the shoulders, but still sharp-eyed. Stevens introduced himself, said he was following up on an old missing persons case. Doyle's jaw tightened when he heard Thomas's name. The detective's questions started simple: where he'd been that week, whether he'd seen or heard anything unusual. Doyle's answers were short, uncertain. First, he said he'd been home, then changed it to visiting relatives in Bryson City. When Stevens pressed, he shrugged, said it was too long ago to remember. His eyes darted toward the truck parked behind us, the one with the small crane rig attached. I caught the way Stevens looked at it too. That rig could have lifted more than 1,000 pounds without breaking a sweat. When Doyle noticed our eyes on it, he smiled in that quick defensive way a man does when he knows he's being watched. We left without incident, but neither of us spoke much on the ride back. There was something about that visit that didn't sit right, something too controlled about Doyle's nervousness, like a man rehearsing his guilt. A few weeks later, Stevens went back with a warrant to look through the property. He asked me to come along as an extra set of eyes. The house smelled faintly of old varnish and cigarette smoke, the kind of scent that clings to walls after decades of solitude. Every room was crowded with tools, cans of nails, bits of lumber stacked in corners. In the workshop out back, dust floated through slanted light from a small window. That's where we found them 3 concrete slabs leaned up against the wall, each roughly the size of a grave marker. Doyle said he used them as bases for posts part of his carpentry work. But when Stevens asked how many he'd bought originally, Doyle hesitated, then said he couldn't remember. I remember standing there looking at those slabs, feeling the air turn heavy again. It had the same quiet as the forest the day we found Thomas's truck, like the world holding its breath before something bad reveals itself. Up in the attic, Stevens found an old orange hunting jacket folded under a pile of blankets. It caught my eye immediately because it was the same color Thomas always wore when he hunted. The tag had faded, but the make and size matched. Doyle said it was his, claimed he'd bought it years back at a sporting goods store in town. When Stevens lifted it, I saw the dark stains along the sleeve. They were old and brown, the kind that no wash could take out. Doyle tried to shrug it off, said he'd cut his hand on a saw once, but the look on his face told another story. Stevens bagged it for testing. Days passed, and the town buzzed with quiet talk again, the kind of low hum that spreads through small places when something long buried starts to surface. When the results came back from the lab, they changed everything. The blood on that jacket wasn't Doyle's. It was Thomas Reed's. DNA confirmed it. Stevens called me late one evening to tell me. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight of it beneath. We sat in silence for a moment before he said, "That jacket didn't walk itself into his attic. The next step was careful, too. Careful, if you asked me. Stevens wanted to make sure there'd be no mistakes when they moved in." The sheriff's department secured a second warrant to dig deeper into Doyle's property. They dusted every corner of the workshop, lifted floorboards, tested the soil under the workbench. That's when they found a faint trace of blood between the cracks in the old planks invisible to the eye, until the luminol hit it and the floor lit up blue. Those stains told a story the boards had tried to forget. DNA again matched Thomas. Doyle's workshop had been the place where it happened. They brought him in before dawn 2 mornings later. No sirens, no spectacle, just quiet tires on gravel and a door closing softly behind him. He didn't fight. When they cuffed him, he kept repeating that he didn't know what they were talking about. But the evidence had already started closing around him like a vice. Under the bench, they found a knife with a deer antler handle crusted with old residue too small to see but enough for the lab to read. Bone fragments, dried blood again, Thomas's. When I heard, I drove down to the sheriff's office, stood outside under the humming light of the parking lot. The night smelled of rain and dust, and for the first time in years the air felt charged again, as if the mountain itself was about to breathe out what it had been holding in. Stevens came out to meet me, tired but wired with purpose. He said Doyle was still denying everything, but the walls were closing in. "He'll talk," Stevens said quietly. "It's only a matter of time." And he was right. A few days later, Doyle did talk. He sat in that interview room for hours, staring at the table until something inside him gave way. He started to speak not in confession exactly, but in fragments. Words about anger, about offense, about things that had gotten out of hand. Stevens told me later that when he said Thomas's name out loud, Doyle flinched like it hurt to hear it. Even now, when I think of those long months, I don't feel triumph, just the slow ache of understanding. Truth doesn't always come clean. Sometimes it crawls out from under the weight of years covered in dirt and guilt. Susan flew back up from Georgia when she heard about the arrest. She stopped by my house before heading to the station. She looked smaller somehow, but her voice was steady when she said, "I just want to know what happened. That's all." That night, the rain came down hard across the mountains, filling the creeks, washing over the roots and rocks where we'd once searched for him. Somewhere out there, not far from where his truck had sat all those years ago, the ground still held what was left of him, and we didn't know it yet. But we would. The truth was waiting under a slab of concrete in a forgotten corner of the forest, where even the birds had stopped singing. And before spring was over, the mountains would give him back. The morning the boys found the well, I was sitting at the diner, same booth I'd sat in for years, watching the light crawl across the linoleum. It was early April of 2007, the kind of spring morning when the air smells half like rain and half like thawed earth. The waitress had just poured me a second cup when the deputy came through the door, his face pale and tight. He didn't say much, just that I needed to come with him. Something had been found out near the old McClellan farm about a mile from where the skull turned up the year before. I didn't ask questions on the ride. You learn after so long in these hills that sometimes silence is the only way to prepare for what's waiting. When we got there, the place was crawling with people, sheriff's cars, a crane truck, yellow tape strung around a patch of ground that hadn't seen a living soul in decades. The farm was nothing more than the stone bones of a house, the collapsed ribs of a barn, and that well sitting in the middle of a small grove. The air smelled like rust and moss. I could see the teenagers who'd found it, 3 of them standing off to the side near the road, still looking spooked like they'd seen a ghost. One of them, the taller boy, told us he'd noticed a concrete slab covering the well, clean and square against the old stonework. Said it looked newer than everything else around it, and he'd gotten curious. They'd tried to pry it up just enough to shine a flashlight down. What they saw at the bottom had sent them running. The sheriff motioned for everyone to step back. The crane operator fired up his rig, the metal cables clicking and whining as they hooked onto the slab. I'll never forget that sound, the slow lift of concrete pulling free the hollow echo that followed. When the slab swung aside and daylight hit the dark below, a wave of silence passed through the crowd. The smell came first, wet earth, and something old, something final, then the shape. White, tangled, unmistakable. A human skeleton curled like it had been dropped and forgotten by time itself. They lowered a forensic tech into the shaft, a woman named Dr. Washington, who moved with a calm precision that made everything around her seem to slow down. Her voice carried up from the dark, steady but low. She described what she saw, wrists bound behind the back ankles, tied bones fractured in a way that spoke of violence, not accident. There were deep marks on the skull, blunt trauma to the head, and thin, deliberate cuts across the ribs. Those of us standing above hardly breathed. I remember the sheriff turning away, rubbing the bridge of his nose. None of us said Thomas's name, not yet, but we all felt it in our chests. They pulled the remains out piece by piece, careful as surgeons, and laid them out on a tarp beside the well. Next to the bones was a leather wallet, darkened and warped from years of damp. Inside was the ghost of a driver's license, barely legible, but the name was still there. Thomas Reed. The air seemed to go still when we saw it. For 5 years we'd been searching for a man, and now he was back silent, reduced to bones, and a name we'd never stopped saying. Susan flew in the next morning. I met her at the sheriff's office, and when she walked through that door, it was like watching someone step into the moment they'd been both dreading and needing. She carried a small box, his dental records, some old photos, and a comb she'd kept all these years with his hair still caught in the teeth. She didn't speak much, just nodded when the sheriff told her they'd do everything by the book. Watching her hands tremble as she passed that box over it was the kind of quiet grief that stays with you. There's no right sound for that kind of moment. Over the next few days, the lab confirmed what we already knew in our hearts. The dental work matched perfectly. DNA left no doubt. The man in that well was Thomas Reed. The sheriff called me the night the results came, and his voice thin over the static. "We've got him, Dan," he said, and then after a long pause, "but we still don't know why." The investigation turned fast after that. The condition of the remains told its own story. Thomas had been beaten and stabbed 7 times, the coroner said, before his body was bound and dumped. Whoever did it had tried to hide him well. The concrete slab wasn't something a man could lift alone. It had been placed with machinery, maybe the same kind of small crane that sat behind Christopher Doyle's workshop. That connection was too close to ignore. When Stevens went back to question Doyle again, I tagged along. Doyle's house looked even lonelier than before, paint-peeling yard, cluttered with old tools and wood scraps. He came to the door slower this time, shoulders hunched like he'd aged 10 years since the last visit. When the detective mentioned the well, I saw the flicker in his eyes, a flash of recognition he couldn't smother. He tried to play it off, said he didn't know any old farms in that area, then stumbled over his own words. Stevens asked if he'd mind another look around. Doyle hesitated, then opened the door wide. The search went room to room, and every creak of the floorboards felt like they were speaking for him. In the attic, we found the same space where the jacket had been. The corner where it once lay now empty, as if he'd known we'd come back. Down in the workshop, that crane truck sat in the garage cables coiled neat on the bed. Stevens knelt beside it, running his fingers along the grooves of the steel where paint had chipped. There were faint scratches that looked newer than the rest. "Like something heavy dragged across it," he said quietly. Doyle stood nearby, jaw set, sweat forming along his hairline. Later that night, the lab confirmed that the jacket stains matched Thomas's blood, and the paint chips from the crane matched residue found on the underside of the concrete slab from the well. The sheriff didn't wait. The arrest came at dawn 2 days later. Doyle didn't resist. He didn't say a word, not when they read him his rights, not when they searched the house again, not even when they loaded him into the cruiser. He just looked straight ahead, face blank, like a man watching his own story finally catch up to him. They held him in county for 3 days. His lawyer came and went, saying there wasn't enough to prove anything beyond circumstantial. But when the investigators went back into that workshop with luminol, they found what the naked eye couldn't. The floorboards glowed with the faint outline of a large stain blood that had seeped into the cracks, cleaned but never gone. It matched Thomas again. Beneath the bench, they found a knife handle carved from deer antler, the blade dull and rusted but still carrying fragments of bone. When they showed Doyle the photos, he broke. Not with shouting or tears, just a slow collapse. He put his hands on the table, stared at them like they weren't his, and finally said, "It wasn't supposed to go that far." His voice cracked once, then steadied as if confessing to himself more than to them. He told Stevens it started as another argument, same as before, about land, about respect, about pride. Thomas had come by to talk, and Doyle, in his words, lost it. Said he grabbed a hammer first, then the knife. Said the forest was the only place that could keep a secret that big. I wasn't there for the full confession, but Stevens called me after. He sounded older somehow, his voice lined with fatigue. He buried him in plain sight, he said. The man used to hunt those same woods. He knew nobody would ever think to look in a forgotten well. When I finally drove out there one last time, the clearing looked almost peaceful again. The tape was gone, the ground smoothed over, but the well still stood mouth open to the air. The wind came through the trees, soft and slow, carrying the smell of pine and rain. I thought about all the years we'd walked those trails, calling his name into the emptiness, never realizing he'd been so close all along. The forest had held him in silence, waiting for us to listen. I stood there until the light began to fade, watching shadows move through the grove. Somewhere beyond the ridge I could hear the faint echo of a hammer striking metal from another property, maybe a farmer fixing his fence. The sound carried through the woods like a memory, rhythmic and hollow. And in that fading light, with the air cooling around me, I realized the truth had been right there the whole time, buried not just in the earth, but in the kind of anger that outlives reason. They say the mountains never forget, that they keep their secrets until they're ready to give them up. Standing there beside that well, I believed it. What those boys found wasn't just a body, it was the end of a silence that had lasted 5 long years. But endings like that aren't clean. They echo, they linger. And as the sun sank behind the ridge, the shadows stretched longer across the clearing, pointing toward the farmhouse where it had all begun. It wasn't over yet, not for Susan, not for this town, and not for me. The trial would come, and with it, the hard reckoning of what justice really costs. But that's another part of the story. The trial took place that fall 5 months after they pulled Thomas's remains from the old well. I remember the courthouse being colder than usual that week, the kind of cold that seeps into the floor tiles and follows you home. The town had waited a long time for that room to fill with answers, but when the testimony began, there wasn't much satisfaction in it. It was quiet, subdued, almost reverent. People came in pairs, old neighbors and friends sitting shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped in their laps. Susan sat up front every day, her face still, her eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. Christopher Doyle looked smaller than I remembered. The weight he carried wasn't physical anymore. It was something else, a kind of hollow that had eaten through whatever fight he once had left. The prosecution laid out the story piece by piece, the blood in the workshop floorboards, the knife, the jacket, the crane marks on the slab. Every detail landed like a slow echo. The photographs of the well were the hardest to look at. You could feel the room draw breath when they showed them the dark, stony walls, the coiled rope still tied in knots around bones. It didn't matter how much time had passed. That image settled into all of us and stayed there. Doyle didn't say much during the trial. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the table, only speaking once when the judge asked if he understood the charges. His lawyer tried to argue diminished responsibility, said it was a confrontation that spiraled out of control. But there was too much in the record to soften what he'd done. When the verdict finally came guilty of second-degree murder, the air seemed to loosen like the whole room had been holding its breath for 5 years. Susan didn't cry. She just nodded once, slow and steady as if the weight of those words pressed down but didn't crush her. Afterward, she told me she wasn't sure what justice was supposed to feel like. "It doesn't give you him back," she said. "It just stops the world from forgetting." I think that's what it really meant. Not closure. There's no such thing but acknowledgement. Proof that what she knew all along was true. Doyle was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. The day they took him away, the mountains were shrouded in fog, the kind that swallows sound. I stood outside the courthouse steps watching the transport van pull out, and it struck me that the man who'd hidden a body under concrete and silence was now being hidden himself behind steel and stone. Some might call that balance. To me, it felt more like symmetry. One life buried in the ground, the other buried alive. After the sentencing, Susan stayed in Franklin for a few weeks before going back to Georgia. She asked if I'd drive her up to the site one last time. It was late afternoon when we parked near the clearing. The trees were thick with early fall color, golden light spilling through the branches, the kind of beauty that feels too gentle for what happened there. The well had been sealed again this time with reinforced concrete and a small brass plaque set into the stone, Thomas Reed, 1956-2002. No dates for discovery or death, no mention of how or where. Just his name, plain and clean like the way he lived. We stood there for a long time without speaking. The forest around us was quiet except for the soft drift of leaves and the hum of a far-off creek. She knelt once, placed her hand on the stone, and whispered something I couldn't hear. When she stood, she looked different still, tired, still carrying the years, but lighter somehow, like part of the weight had finally been shared with the earth. Before we left, she turned to me and said, "He's home now." And I believed her. After she moved back to Georgia for good, the town slipped into its own kind of silence. People stopped talking about the case, though it was still there beneath the surface woven into the hills. Sometimes when I drive through the forest, I catch myself slowing near that turnoff, half expecting to see that old blue Ford parked in the clearing again. It's been decades, but memory plays tricks that way. It doesn't age. It just waits. Sheriff Harris retired a few years later. He told me once that solving Thomas's case was the hardest thing he ever worked, not because of what they found, but because of how long the silence lasted before it gave up its secret. Detective Stevens stayed on with the department another 10 years, then moved to Asheville to teach forensics. He still writes me every Christmas. In his last letter, he said he sometimes dreams of the well of the sound the rope made when they lifted the bones into daylight. He said it's not the horror that lingers, but the quiet after the stillness of knowing the truth finally had a name. As for me, I stayed in Franklin. I retired, spent more time walking the trails near the ridge sometimes with my grandson now. He's curious about everything, asks about the old road, about the places we pass. I tell him stories about the people who came before, about the woods themselves, but not this one. Not yet. Some stories, I think, belong to the grown version of yourself when you're old enough to understand how easily a simple argument can turn into a tragedy that echoes through generations. Every now and then, when the air turns cold and the leaves start to fall, I'll catch a whiff of that same smoky autumn smell from all those years ago. It takes me right back to the clearing, the sound of our boots crunching through frost, the empty truck waiting like a question no one could answer. The forest doesn't give up its dead easily, but it also doesn't forget them. Neither do we. The reeds are buried side by side now in the small cemetery behind the church at the edge of town. Susan passed away last year. Her daughter brought her ashes home, said she wanted her mother close to where her father was found. The day they laid her to rest, the sun was breaking through the clouds, that same pale gold light threading through the trees. Standing there, I felt that old stillness again, not empty, not painful, just quiet. Time smooths over most things, but not the truth. The truth stays sharp even when the edges dull everywhere else. I've lived long enough to know that peace doesn't come from answers. It comes from remembering. Remembering the faces, the choices, the way a person's absence can fill a room more than their presence ever did. That's what I carry with me now. The echo of his laughter, the warmth of those old autumn days, the faith that even in the deepest dark, something in this world still leans toward light. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Somewhere out there in a quiet forest or a forgotten town, someone's still waiting for the sound of truth to break the silence.